The air in the Tucson bank was a stale mix of oiled leather brass polish and the faint dry scent of money. It was an aroma Eva Turner associated with duty a monthly errand for her father that felt more like a ritual than a necessity. Outside, the sun hammered the dusty street into a blinding white glare. But inside the cool dimness was a temporary reprieve. Eva stood at the teller's window, her gloved fingers resting on the polished mahogany, waiting as Mr. Abernathy, a man whose face seemed permanently pinched with financial concern, counted out the payroll coin. Suddenly, the cheerful jingle of the bell above the door was replaced by the solid, definitive thud of the door being barred shut. A collective gasp rippled through the half-dozen patrons. Eva turned her heart, giving a single hard jolt against her ribs. 4 men stood inside the entrance, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas. But it was the man who stepped forward, the one without a mask, who commanded the room. He was tall and lean, dressed in a black duster that seemed to absorb the light. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, with eyes so pale a blue they were startling against his sun-darkened skin. He moved with a languid grace that was more menacing than any brutish display of force. A faint ironic smile played on his lips. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice a low-cultured baritone that carried easily through the stunned silence. "My associates and I require a brief period of your undivided attention. Please remain calm. Cooperation will be rewarded with continued respiration." His men, rougher figures with pistols already drawn, began herding the customers and staff against the far wall. One of them swept Mr. Abernathy's freshly counted stacks of coin into a canvas sack with a greedy clatter. But the leader's gaze wasn't on the money. It was sweeping the room, analytical and searching until it landed on Eva. He walked toward her, his boot heels clicking a slow, deliberate rhythm on the marble floor. The smile on his face widened slightly, but it never reached his eyes. Those eyes were fixed on the silver locket resting against the high collar of her dress. "Richard Turner's daughter," he stated, not a question. "I'd recognize that fire in the eyes anywhere." He always did have a taste for beautiful things he didn't deserve. Eva stood her ground, her chin held high, though a cold dread was seeping into her limbs. "I don't know who you are." "Oh, I think you do," he purred, stopping a mere arm's length from her. "Or rather, your father does. My name is Elias Blackwood." He savored the name, letting it hang in the air like a threat. "Now I'll have the key." Key. Eva's mind raced. The payroll money was already taken. Blackwood's patience thinned, the smile vanishing. "Don't play the fool, Miss Turner. The key to your father's safe deposit box. Number 73. Abernathy, pale and trembling against the wall, whimpered, "We can't. Bank policy." One of Blackwood's men silenced him with the barrel of a pistol pressed to his temple. Blackwood never took his eyes off Eva. "The key," he repeated, his voice dropping to a silken whisper. "Or this well-appointed establishment will be redecorated in a rather ghastly shade of red." Her hand trembled as she reached into her reticule, her fingers closing around the cold, ornate brass key. She held it out to him, her gaze defiant. "Take it. But my father will see you hang for this." Blackwood chuckled, a dry, mirthless sound. He took the key, his fingers brushing hers, and the contact was like a spark of ice. His eyes, however, moved from the key back to her throat. Before she could react, he reached out, and his fingers, surprisingly delicate, closed around her locket. With a sharp tug, the fine silver chain snapped. He held it up, dangling it between his thumb and forefinger, the sunlight from the high windows catching the polished surface. "And this," he said softly as a reminder, "tell your father that I am not a man who forgets a debt. I'm just taking back what's mine, Miss Turner." He opened the locket. The tiny hand-painted portrait of her mother, a woman Eva barely remembered, stared out from its silver frame. A wave of violation so sharp and personal it stole her breath, washed over her. It was more than theft. It was desecration. "Give that back," she whispered, her voice shaking with a rage that eclipsed her fear. That was my mother's. Blackwood's gaze was pitiless. He snapped the locket shut, the sound echoing in the silent room, and slipped it into his waistcoat pocket. She should have chosen a better man. He turned to his men. We have what we came for. He strode to the back, key in hand, while his men kept their pistols trained on the terrified hostages. Moments later, he returned a slim leather portfolio tucked under his arm. He gave Ava one last lingering look, a look that promised this was only a beginning. And then with a nod to his men, they unbarred the door and vanished back into the blinding glare of the Arizona sun. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was Mr. Abernathy's ragged breathing. Then the spell-broken people began to sob, to murmur, to shout. But Ava heard none of it. Her hand was pressed to the hollow of her throat where the locket had been the place where the cold silver used to rest. It was a phantom weight, an echo of a loss far deeper than money. The robbery wasn't just about a key or a box. It was about memory, about family, and Elias Blackwood had just declared a war on both. In that moment, broken and furious, in the silent bank, Eva Turner was no longer a pampered daughter running an errand. She was a woman with an enemy. The ride back to the Double T Ranch was a blur of ochre earth and blue sky, the familiar landscape rendered alien by the cold knot of fury in Eva's stomach. The silver locket had been a constant presence, a tangible link to the smiling, gentle-faced woman in the portrait who had died when Ava was only 5. Blackwood hadn't just stolen an object. He had stolen a piece of her past. She found her father, Richard Turner, in his study. It was a room that smelled of old leather cigar smoke and power. Maps of his vast holdings covered one wall, his territory marked out in bold, proprietary lines of ink. He stood with his back to her, staring out the window at the distant mountains, a titan in his own kingdom. At 60, he was still a formidable figure, with a mane of silver hair and a gaze that could make grown men quail. He was a man accustomed to being obeyed, a man who had carved his empire from the desert with will and steel. "Father," she said, her voice tighter than she intended. He turned, his stern features softening for a moment at the sight of her, then hardening again as he took in her pale face and the frantic energy simmering in her eyes. "Eva, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." The bank in Tucson was robbed. His posture stiffened. The payroll, they took it. But that isn't what they were after. She took a breath, the words catching in her throat. "A man named Elias Blackwood. He knew who I was. He wanted the key to your safe deposit box. He took it." She paused, her hand instinctively going to her neck. "And he took Mother's locket." Richard's face, a weathered mask of control, seemed to crumble. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a gray, papery pallor. He sank heavily into his leather chair, his formidable presence suddenly diminished. He stared at his desk, at the neat stacks of ledgers and deeds, but his eyes were seeing something else. Entirely, something from a long time ago. "Blackwood," he rasped. The name was a curse on his tongue. I thought they were all gone." "Who is he?" Ava demanded, stepping closer. "He said you knew him. He said he was taking back what was his." Richard waved a dismissive, trembling hand. "An outlaw. A common thief with a grudge. The law will handle him." "He wasn't a common thief." Ava's voice rose sharp with frustration. "He was articulate, precise. He knew about the box. What was in it, Father? What was so important that he would risk a daylight robbery in the middle of Tucson?" "Ranch business," he said curtly, his mask of authority sliding back into place. "Deeds, contracts. Nothing for you to concern yourself with." He looked up at her, his eyes pleading for the first time she could ever remember. "The locket." "I am sorry, Eva. Truly. I will hire men, the best trackers. We will get it back." But his evasion only fueled her suspicion. The ranch was more than successful. It was an institution. Yet lately she'd heard the whispers. A bad year for cattle prices, a long drought that had withered the grazing lands, a loan from the bank in Tucson that was larger than anyone admitted. The contents of that box were not just ranch business. They were critical. And Blackwood knew it. That night, sleep offered no escape. Ava dreamt of pale blue eyes and a mocking smile of her mother's portrait, staring up from a stranger's hand. She woke before dawn, the dream clinging to her like a shroud. She dressed and slipped out of the silent house, heading not for the stables, but for her father's study. The room was dark, the moon casting long shadows across the floor. She lit a single lamp, its golden glow illuminating the massive oak desk. She had no idea what she was looking for, only a desperate need to understand the secret her father was so determined to keep. Her fingers traced the spines of the leather-bound ledgers. She pulled one out, then another. Accounts, sales records, wage payments. Nothing. Her gaze fell upon a small, locked rosewood box on the corner of the desk, one she had seen her entire life, but never thought to question. A letter opener from her father's desk set provided the simple tool she needed. The lock, old and simple, gave with a quiet click. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed newspaper clippings and dried flowers, was a thin stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. She recognized her mother's elegant script. Most were mundane notes about social calls and household needs. But one tucked at the very bottom was different. The handwriting was frantic, the ink slightly blurred as if by tears. Asterisk, my dearest. Richard, asterisk, it began. Asterisk, I cannot bear the silence in this house any longer. The whispers from the hands, the way the Blackwood name is spoken like a prayer or a curse. What you did to that family for the water rights at Silver Creek. It haunts my sleep. This land feels tainted. This wealth feels like blood money. If we do not make this right, I fear God will exact a price from us far greater than any land is worth. I beg you, sell the claim back to them. Let us build our future on honest ground. Ava's breath caught. Blackwood. Water rights. Asterisk. What you did. Asterisk. Her father, the respectable, powerful Richard Turner, had built his legacy on a crime. A crime so grievous, it had tormented her mother to her grave. And then she saw it lying beneath the letters. A folded document, a copy of an official filing. It was the deed to the entire Double T Ranch, the original claim registered with the territorial government. Her father had kept a copy here, but the original, the one that held the true legal power, must have been what he kept in the safe deposit box. Blackwood hadn't stolen it to use it. If her mother's letter was true, the deed itself was likely fraudulent. Blackwood's goal was simpler and far more devastating. He meant to destroy it, erasing the Turner claim to the land, entirely leaving them with nothing but the dust of their own ruin. Her father's words echoed in her mind, asterisk, the law will handle him. But the law wouldn't be fast enough. Blackwood could be halfway to Mexico by now, a single match away from destroying everything they had. A new resolve, cold and sharp as glass, settled over her. Her father was paralyzed by the ghosts of his past. The law was too slow, too distant. She would not wait for a man to save her family. She looked at her mother's portrait on the mantelpiece, at the kind, sad eyes. Asterisk, I will make it right, Mama. She folded the letter and the copy of the deed, tucking them safely into her dress. She wouldn't ride to the trackers or the sheriff. She would ride to the Wells Fargo office in Silver Creek, the next town over. The main branch held duplicates of all major territorial filings. If she could get there, secure a certified copy before Blackwood destroyed the original, she could at least create a legal battle, a stay against utter ruin. It was a desperate gamble, but it was hers to make. As the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and rose, Eva saddled her fastest mare, Artemis. She left no note. She told no one. With a small canteen, a pouch of dried jerky, and a secret that now felt like a lead weight in her soul, she rode out not as a pampered daughter, but as the sole defender of a tarnished legacy. The desert stretched before her vast and unforgiving, and somewhere within it, a man with pale eyes held her past in one hand and her future in the other. The trail to Silver Creek was a gash of rust-colored dirt cutting through a landscape of giants. Saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels, their arms raised to a pitiless sky. The air was thin and hot, vibrating with the drone of insects. Eva pushed Artemis hard, the rhythmic drumming of hooves, a counterpoint to the frantic beating of her own heart. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every gust of wind sounded like a whispered name, asterisk, Blackwood asterisk. She had been riding for hours when she saw the dust cloud ahead, rising from a narrow pass between two mesas. Too small for a wagon train, too deliberate for a dust devil. Her blood ran cold. She pulled Artemis to a halt behind a jumble of sun-bleached boulders, her hand straying to the small Colt revolver. Her father had insisted she learn to use a weapon she had always disdained as unladylike. Now its weight in her saddlebag felt like the only comfort in the world. 3 riders emerged from the pass, moving at an easy lope, their figures shimmering in the heat. Even from a distance, she recognized the confident, predatory slump of the men from the bank. And leading them on a powerful black gelding was Elias Blackwood. They were cutting her off, anticipating her route. He must have known about the Wells Fargo office, known it was her only logical move. Panic, sharp and metallic, rose in her throat. She fought it down, forcing her mind to work. She couldn't outrun them on open ground. Her only chance was the rough country to the south, a maze of arroyos and canyons where a single rider might find cover. She wrenched Artemis's reins, wheeling the mare around and kicking her into a desperate gallop. A shout echoed from behind her. The chase was on. The world dissolved into a thunder of hooves and a burning in her lungs. Wind whipped tears from her eyes, plastering stray strands of hair to her face. The terrain grew harsher, the ground littered with sharp rocks and thorny creosote bushes. Behind her, the shouts grew louder, punctuated by the sharp crack of a pistol. A bullet whined past her ear, terrifyingly close. She urged Artemis faster, the mare's sides heaving, foam flying from her bit. They plunged into a wide, sandy wash, the deep sand sucking at the horse's hooves, slowing them dangerously. Another shot rang out, and this time it was not a miss. Artemis screamed a sound of pure agony that tore through Eva. The mare stumbled, her front legs buckling. The world spun a blur of ochre earth and blue sky before impact stole her breath. Eva was thrown clear, her body tumbling through the air in a dreadful, weightless arc. She hit the edge of the wash, hard, her side slamming against the rocky bank, before she slid down into a shallow ravine carved by flash floods. A white-hot agony erupted in her leg, sharp as a shard of glass. She tried to cry out, but the air had been driven from her body. She lay on her back, gasping, the desert sun, a blinding eye, staring down at her. Above, on the edge of the wash, she heard the riders pull up. "Did you get her?" one of them yelled. "The horse is down," came Blackwood's calm reply. "Check the ravine." Ava's mind screamed at her to move, to hide, to do anything. She tasted fear and dust together. Pushing through the searing pain, she dragged herself behind a meager outcrop of rock, her broken leg trailing uselessly behind her. Her fingers fumbled for the revolver in her saddlebag, which had blessedly landed nearby. She pulled it free, the metal hot from the sun, her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold it. The crunch of boots on gravel grew closer. A shadow fell over her. "Well, well," Blackwood said, looking down at her from the rim of the ravine. His pale eyes showed no surprise, no pity. "It seems your luck has run out, Miss Turner." He started to slide down the embankment. "Stay back," Eva cried, leveling the pistol with both trembling hands. Blackwood paused, an amused smile touching his lips. "You have your father's spirit, I'll grant you that. But not his aim, I'd wager." He took another step. Ava squeezed her eyes shut and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening, the recoil slamming her wrist back against the rock. When she opened her eyes, Blackwood was gone. For one wild, impossible moment, she thought she'd hit him. Then she heard his low chuckle, a warning shot, how very civilized. He was standing just out of sight. "You're out of your depth, little bird. Give me the deed you're carrying, and I'll leave you for the coyotes. A quicker death than I gave your horse." The deed, he knew. Her blood turned to ice. She had nothing. No leverage, no hope. She was broken alone and at his mercy. But mercy was not in Elias Blackwood's vocabulary. The sound of his boots receded. "Leave her," he called to his men. "The desert will claim her soon enough. We have what we need." The hoofbeats faded, leaving behind an unbearable silence, broken only by the buzzing of a fly and her own ragged breaths. Artemis lay dead in the wash, a monument to her failure. The sun beat down, relentless and cruel. Eva lay broken in the ravine, a prisoner of the vast, empty wilderness. She stared at the sky, at its serene, impossible blue. How dare it stay so calm while her world lay in ruins, despair as hot and draining as the sun began to settle over her. She closed her eyes, the weight of it all too much to bear. A shadow fell across her face, different from before. Not the sharp, predatory shadow of a man, but something broader, cooler. She forced her eyes open. A figure stood over her, silhouetted against the blinding sky. He was tall, his frame lean and wiry. A coil of rawhide was slung over one shoulder, and his black hair was bound in 2 braids, each tied with a strip of faded red cloth. His eyes, dark and level, studied her with an unnerving, unhurried intensity. An Apache. Every warning her father had ever given, every whispered tale of raids and savagery flared in her mind. She stiffened, trying to raise the heavy pistol again, but her strength failed her. "You're hurt," he said. His voice was low, and even a stark contrast to the violence that had just transpired. "My horse. They shot my horse," she managed the words, a fractured whisper. He crouched beside her, his movements fluid and deliberate. He kept his hands open, a clear gesture that he meant no harm. "I'm Hugh," he said. His gaze went to her unnaturally angled leg. "Let me look." Pain and prejudice warred within her. But the agony in her leg was a louder, more convincing argument. She gave a small, defeated nod. His touch was surprisingly gentle as his fingers probed the area around her boot. He was methodical, his focus absolute, as if he were diagnosing the weakness in a rock formation rather than the break in a human bone. "The bone is broken clean," he announced, his face impassive. "You pushed yourself clear of the horse. That saved your life." He looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. "I will splint it." He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a lifetime of self-sufficiency. From the tough, sinewy branches of a mesquite bush and strips of cloth torn from his own shirt, he fashioned a crude but effective brace, binding her leg with lengths of rawhide. As he worked, the initial throbbing in her leg began to dull into a more manageable ache. When he finished, he offered her his canteen. The water was cool and tasted of earth and metal, the most welcome thing she had ever known. "I am Eva Turner," she said, her voice still weak. "My family's ranch is miles from here. If you could send word." "You cannot ride," he stated firmly, cutting her off. It wasn't unkind, merely a fact. "My cabin is close. It will be safer there until the sun drops. Then I will find your people." She blinked at his quiet certainty. No one save her father had ever spoken to her with such direct, unadorned authority. Yet exhaustion and pain had stripped her of the will to argue. She watched as he easily slid his arms beneath her. He lifted her as if she weighed no more than a child, his strength contained and effortless. Pain flared in her leg, a bright, sickening wave, but she clenched her teeth against it and did not cry out. She rested her head against his shoulder, succumbing to the strange, disorienting reality of being carried through the desert by a man she should have feared. His cabin was nestled in a hidden crease of the land, tucked beneath a grove of cottonwood trees that signaled a hidden spring. It was a single room, built of rough-hewn boards and a mud-and-thatch roof patched with scavenged tin. To Eva, raised in a sprawling hacienda with polished floors and silver candlesticks, it was impossibly spare. But it was not squalid. A sense of profound order permeated the small space. Every tool had its place, every stack of firewood was neatly arranged. Nothing was wasted, nothing was for show. He laid her gently on a low cot framed with willow branches and topped with cured hides. At the stone hearth, he coaxed a small flame to life, the scent of wood smoke filling the air. He moved about the cabin with the same silent efficiency, boiling water in a blackened pot and crushing a mixture of leaves and bark in a stone bowl. The air soon filled with a clean, sharp, earthy smell. Willow bark yarrow and something else, something green and pungent. He poured a dark tea into a single tin cup and handed it to her. "It will ease the pain," he said. She sipped it. The taste was bitter, but it slid down her throat like a warm tide, carrying a gentle numbness with it. "You sound very sure." "I am sure of very little." He answered, his gaze distant for a moment. "But of this I am." The simple, unvarnished honesty of his words struck her more deeply than any polished courtesy ever had. He was a man who lived by truths he could touch and see, not by the shifting allegiances of society. He prepared a poultice from the remaining crushed herbs, and after a moment's hesitation, she allowed him to cut away her riding boot. He packed the cool, damp paste around her swollen ankle, the relief immediate and profound. She leaned back against the wall, the world slowly coming back into focus. "You'll forgive me for saying so," she murmured, a flicker of her old self returning, "but this isn't exactly the Plaza Hotel." His eyes, which had been so serious, softened. A hint of something, perhaps a smile, touched the corner of his mouth. "This place is just wood and mud," he said, his voice quiet. "The pain is what you brought with you. When it leaves, you will see this place differently." Despite herself, a small laugh escaped her lips, a quick, bright sound in the quiet cabin. The stark walls seemed to retreat the space, feeling less like a prison and more like a shelter. Hugh gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging that laughter was as useful a medicine as willow bark. As the afternoon light slanted through the single window, he tended to his own small tasks. He sharpened his knife with a whetstone, his movements rhythmic and meditative. He mended a tear in a leather pouch with an awl and sinew. He did not speak, and yet the silence was not empty. It was a companionable quiet, filled with the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind in the cottonwoods outside. Ava watched him, her artist's eye taking in the economy of his posture, the steady competence of his hands. Her privileged world had been stripped away in a single violent afternoon, leaving her broken and helpless. She had fallen not just from her horse, but from her life. And this stranger, this reclusive Apache man, had caught her. As dusk began to purple the sky, he packed a small bundle. "I will follow the tracks of the men who did this," he said. "They lead back toward your lands. I will bring word to your father, and leave me here." The thought sent a tremor of her old fear through her, but she masked it with a flash of wry humor. "Alone with your cabin ghosts?" "There are no ghosts," he replied, his expression serious. "Only the sounds of the night." She managed a thin smile. "Then perhaps I'll teach the night sounds to laugh." He paused in the doorway, turning back to look at her. His mouth curved a faint and fleeting expression that transformed his stoic face. "It seems you make friends easily, except with runaway horses," she quipped. This time he did laugh. It was a low, warm sound that seemed to surprise even him. It resonated in the small cabin, chasing away the last of the shadows. And in that moment, Ava felt a strange and unexpected sense of peace. She was a captive of circumstance, a patient in a rustic infirmary. But for the first time since the robbery, she did not feel entirely alone. As Hugh stepped out into the falling light, she lay back the scent of herbs and wood smoke, a comforting balm, and wondered if her path had been destroyed or if it had just truly begun. Time in the cabin moved to a different rhythm, dictated not by the hands of a clock, but by the shifting arc of the sun and the needs of a healing body. Eva woke each morning to the smell of brewing herbs and the steady crackle of the fire Hugh had stoked in the pre-dawn chill. Her leg was a constant dull ache, a reminder of her vulnerability. But with each passing day, Hugh's ministrations, the cool poultices, the bitter tea, the carefully prepared splint, seemed to draw the fire from the injury. Their conversations were sparse, built from questions and simple, direct answers. He was a man who used words like precious resources, never wasting them on pleasantries. Yet, in his quiet way, he taught her. He showed her how to identify the plants he used for healing, how to read the subtle shifts in the wind, how to listen to the desert instead of just looking at it. My grandmother taught me, he explained one afternoon as he ground dried leaves in his stone bowl. Herbs, bones, water. She said a man should learn to keep people alive before he learns to hunt. She sounds like a sensible woman, Eva said, propped up on her elbows. What happened to her? Hugh's hands stilled for a fraction of a second. The army moved our people from the high country, he said, his tone flat, devoid of emotion. She did not survive the march. The subject was sealed, the finality in his voice, a wall she knew better than to try and climb. Separated from the constant hum of the ranch, from the duties and expectations of being a Turner, Eva began to see the world through a new lens. She learned the value of a single cup of clean water, the warmth of a fire on a cold night, the deep satisfaction of a simple meal of beans and wild onions. She had been stripped of everything that defined her, and in that emptiness, she was discovering a strength she never knew she possessed. One afternoon, overcome by the need to create, she asked, "Do you have any paper charcoal?" He shook his head. "Paper burns too fast. I keep hides, not sheets." A wave of frustration washed over her. "It's a pity. I like to draw. People, horses, the way the light falls on the mountains. It feels like catching time before it runs away." He considered this for a long moment, then gave a single slow nod. "That is a good skill. Not foolish." The quiet affirmation landed in her chest with surprising weight. At home, her sketching was an idle pastime, a charming hobby for a young lady. Here, in this cabin where everything had to have a purpose, this man who owned almost nothing had deemed it useful. It was a small thing, but it felt like a validation of a part of herself she had always been taught to hide. A few days later, Hugh returned from a walk along the ridges, not with game or herbs, but with a flat piece of shale and a handful of charred sticks from an old fire. He placed them beside her cot without a word. Ava stared at them, then up at him, her throat tight with an emotion she couldn't name. It was the most thoughtful gift she had ever received. She began to draw, sketching the interior of the cabin, the play of light on his face as he worked the stark beauty of the cottonwood branches framed by the doorway. The rough medium forced her to focus on line and shadow to find the essence of her subjects. Her art became less about pretty pictures and more about capturing the truth. One evening, as she sketched the landscape from memory, she drew a map of the valley as she knew it, the Double T Ranch sprawling across the basin, the river snaking through it, the mountains ringing it like a fortress. Hugh came to stand behind her, his shadow falling across the stone. He studied her drawing for a long time. Then he took a piece of charcoal and on a clear patch of shale began to draw his own map. His lines were different. The river followed the same course, but the boundaries he drew were not the straight, angular lines of her father's fences. They were softer, following the contours of the land. He drew a small cluster of markings near Silver Creek. "What is that?" she asked, pointing to the spot. "The Blackwood claim," he said, his voice neutral. "Before." "Before what?" "Before the water was diverted. Before your father came." He met her gaze, his dark eyes holding no judgment, only a quiet statement of fact. He had seen it. He knew. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture more terrible than she had imagined. Her mother's letter, Blackwood's words, and now this map drawn from the memory of a man whose people had been here long before any deeds were filed. The truth was an ugly, sprawling thing, and it was the foundation upon which her entire life had been built. Her healing became a race against time. The stronger her leg grew, the more urgent the need to act became. Hugh crafted a sturdy crutch for her from a cottonwood branch, and she began to take halting steps outside the cabin, rebuilding her strength, her resolve hardening with every painful movement. The bond between them deepened in the shared silence, in the small gestures of care and respect. It was a connection forged not of flirtation or fancy, but of survival and shared humanity. She saw in him a profound dignity, a quiet resilience that shamed the blustering power of the men she had always known. And he, in turn, seemed to see past the rancher's daughter to the woman of grit and spirit beneath. Nearly 3 weeks after her fall, the day came when she knew she could wait no longer. Hugh had been gone since dawn, checking his trap lines. Eva packed her few belongings, her heart a tangled mess of gratitude and grim purpose. She left her drawing of the cabin on the cot, a silent thank you, a promise to remember. Using her new crutch, she made her way slowly to the hidden spring, filled her canteen, and began the long, arduous journey back to the world she had left behind. She was no longer running from Blackwood. She was walking toward a confrontation with her own history, a truth that would either shatter her family or set it free. The sight of the Double T Ranch rising from the valley floor should have been a comfort. Instead, it looked like a monument to a lie. The sprawling adobe house, the sturdy corrals, the vast green of the irrigated pastures, it was all built on the ruin of another family. Ava's return caused a commotion. Ranch hands stared, their hats pulled low in disbelief, and her mother wept with a relief so profound it was painful to watch. But Ava's focus was singular. She found her father in his study exactly where she had left him. He looked older, the weeks of uncertainty having carved new lines into his face. When he saw her alive, leaning on a rough-hewn crutch, a flood of emotion, relief, guilt, anger warred in his eyes. "Eva, by God, where have you been? We've had trackers out for weeks." He moved to embrace her, but she held up a hand, stopping him. "I was found," she said, her voice steady and cold, "by a man whose people you helped drive from this valley." Richard flinched as if struck. "The Apache?" "His name is Hugh," she corrected him. "He saved my life. While I was healing, he showed me something." She pulled out the copy of the deed and her mother's letter, laying them on the polished surface of his desk. Then from memory she drew a rough version of Hugh's map on a blank piece of paper. "He showed me the truth. Her father stared at the collection of documents, at the map of a world that existed before his ambition redrew it. The color drained from his face. For a long, suffocating moment, he said nothing. He simply sank into his chair, the powerful rancher reduced to a tired old man, cornered by his past. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he finally whispered, his gaze fixed on the letter. "Your mother, she never understood. It was a different time. A man had to be ruthless to survive, to build something that would last. Build what Eva's voice cracked the betrayal, a raw wound, a legacy of theft. You didn't just take their land, Father. You took their water. In this country, that's the same as a death sentence. The Blackwood family. What happened to them?" Richard looked away toward the window, overlooking the land he had conquered. "The father. He fought it, of course. Tried to take me to court. But I had the better lawyers, the registered deed. He lost everything. He died a broken man. The mother followed a year later. They had 3 sons. 2 drifted off, died in bar fights or pointless feuds. The youngest, Elias. He was smart, full of fire. He swore he'd see me ruined. I never thought he'd have the stomach to come back. The confession hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Ava's world had not just tilted. It had shattered. Her father was not the hero of her childhood stories. He was a villain. And Elias Blackwood, the ruthless outlaw, was a man forged in the fires of her father's greed. He wasn't seeking wealth. He was seeking an Old Testament brand of justice. He has the original deed, Eva said, her mind racing. He's going to destroy it. He wants to wipe us off the map just like you did to his family. We'll fight him. Richard said, a flicker of his old defiance returning. Legally? We have records, witnesses. He won't fight you in a courtroom. Ava slammed her crutch on the floor for emphasis. He will fight you with fire and blood. We can't win that way. We have to make it right. Make it right. Her father looked at her aghast. By giving up everything I've built for you. It was never yours to give. The argument raged, a storm of grief and anger that had been brewing for decades. But Ava's resolve was unshakable. The girl who had left the ranch weeks ago would have deferred to her father's authority. The woman who returned would not. Driven by a desperate, guilt-ridden need for atonement, Ava made a choice. She would not wait for Blackwood to make the next move. She would go to him. The next morning, she sent word through a known sympathizer in town, a man who traded goods with outlaws and renegades. The message was simple: asterisk, Eva Turner wishes to negotiate. She will offer restitution for the Blackwood claim. She proposed a meeting place, the old abandoned mission at San Xavier, a neutral ground. Her father called her a fool. He'll kill you or worse. He won't, Eva said with a certainty she didn't feel. He doesn't want my life. He wants his family's honor back. Money won't be enough. But it's a start. The meeting was a disaster. Blackwood arrived alone, his pale eyes burning with a cold fire. He listened to her offer a generous sum of money, a portion of the eastern pastures, with a look of utter contempt. Do you think this is about money? He sneered, his voice dripping with scorn. Do you think you can buy back my father's life with your father's coin? My mother died of a broken heart in a dusty hovel because your family slept in a fine house on stolen ground. There is no restitution for that. Then what do you want? Eva pleaded. Tell me what will end this. I want to see your father's empire turn to ash, he said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. I want him to die with nothing, just like my father did. I have the true deed. Soon I will burn it. And when I do, every legal claim you have to this valley will burn with it. He turned to leave his rejection absolute. Desperate, Eva made one last appeal. There has to be a way. For my mother's sake. She knew it was wrong. She begged my father to make it right. Blackwood paused, his back to her. Your mother's only mistake was hitching her wagon to a thief. He walked away, leaving Eva standing alone in the ruins of the old mission, her hopes crumbling to dust. The failure of the negotiation sent a new wave of dread through the Double T. They were living on borrowed time. Every day that passed brought them closer to the moment Blackwood would destroy the deed. Then he forced their hand. A rider came at a full gallop, his face grim. A small group of Blackwood's men had ridden down to the foreman's cottage at the far edge of the property. They hadn't stolen cattle or burned barns. They had taken one thing: Jacob, the ranch foreman, a man who had worked for Richard Turner for over 30 years, a man who had taught Eva how to ride. A note was left pinned to the cottage door. The message was brutally simple. Asterisk, the old Starlight silver mine. Sunset 2 days from now. Bring the original deed, the copy from your father's desk. In exchange for the paper, you get your man back. Come alone, Miss Turner. If I see your father or any of his men, Jacob dies." It was a trap. Eva knew it. Her father knew it. Blackwood had no intention of making a fair exchange. He wanted the last piece of evidence, the final proof of their claim, and he intended to burn it in front of her as the ultimate act of vengeance. "You cannot go," Richard commanded, his face ashen. "It's suicide." "I have to," Eva said, her voice quiet but firm. "We owe Jacob our loyalty, and I am the one who started this. I am the one who went after him." That night, as a storm gathered over the mountains, blotting out the stars, Eva prepared for the journey. She packed lightly water, a compass, and the copy of the deed that felt like a death warrant. As she was about to leave the house, under the cover of darkness, a figure emerged from the shadows of the stable. It was Hugh. He had come down from the mountains, drawn by instinct or some unheard message on the wind. He looked at her, at the grim set of her jaw, and he knew. "This is not your fight," she told him. "You made it my fight when you drew my map," he replied simply. He held out a hand, and in it was her Colt revolver, cleaned and oiled. "The Starlight Mine is treacherous country. The tunnels are unstable. You will not go alone." She looked at him, at the unwavering loyalty in his dark eyes, and the dam of her composure finally broke. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She was terrified, but she was no longer alone. Together, under the bruised and ominous sky, they rode out to face a ghost from the past, to a place where justice and vengeance were set to collide. The Starlight Silver Mine was a skeleton picked clean by greed and time, its entrance a black maw gaping in the side of a windswept mesa. A storm was brewing the sky, a churning cauldron of gray and purple clouds. The wind howled, whipping sand into their faces, a prelude to the violence to come. Eva and Hugh tethered their horses in a sheltered cove and approached the mine on foot, the copy of the deed tucked securely inside Eva's jacket. Blackwood was waiting for them just inside the tunnel, a lantern casting his face in flickering demonic shadows. Two of his men stood behind him, rifles held ready. Jacob, the foreman, was slumped against the rock wall, his hands bound, his face bruised but defiant. "Miss Turner," Blackwood said, his voice echoing in the confined space. "Punctual. I appreciate that in a woman." His eyes flicked to Hugh, a flicker of surprise followed by a sneer. "And you brought your pet Apache." How prudent. Hugh remained silent, his expression unreadable, but his hand rested near the knife at his belt. "The deed," Blackwood demanded, holding out a hand. "Let Jacob go first," Eva countered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Blackwood laughed. "You are in no position to bargain. The deed. Now." Slowly, Eva pulled the folded document from her jacket. She held it up. "Here, take it. But this won't bring your family back. It will only make you the same as the man you hate." "Spare me the sermon," he snarled, snatching the paper from her hand. He unfolded it, his pale eyes scanning the familiar text, a look of triumphant hatred twisting his features. He pulled a match from his pocket, struck it against the rock wall, and held the flame to the corner of the deed. "This is for my father," he hissed as the paper began to curl and blacken. And in that moment, as the last vestige of her family's claim began to turn to ash, the world exploded. It was not a gunshot, but a voice from the shadows behind Blackwood. "The paper you're burning is a copy, Elias." Richard Turner stepped into the lantern light, a shotgun held steady in his hands. He was alone, his face etched with a terrible resolve. Blackwood froze, the burning deed falling from his fingers. "Turner, you old devil. You couldn't let your little girl fight her own battles? This was never her battle." Richard said, his voice heavy with regret. "It was always mine." He took a step forward. "Let the girl and Jacob go, Blackwood. Your fight is with me." Before anyone could react, Hugh moved. With the speed of a striking snake, he threw his knife not at Blackwood, but at the lantern hanging from a wooden pit prop. The blade struck true, shattering the glass. The tunnel was plunged into absolute darkness, thick and suffocating. Chaos erupted. A rifle fired the muzzle flash, a blinding white flower in the dark. Eva threw herself to the ground, pulling Jacob with her. The roar of her father's shotgun answered the sound, deafening in the enclosed space. The entire mine seemed to shudder from the concussion, and a shower of dust and pebbles rained down from the ceiling. "The tunnels are collapsing," someone screamed. A new sound joined the fray, a deep, grinding groan from the earth itself. The mine, old and unstable, was giving way. A massive timber overhead splintered with a sound like breaking bones. Eva scrambled in the darkness, her hands searching for Hugh. Hugh. Here, his voice was close. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward a side passage she hadn't seen. "This way, it leads to an air shaft." They half-carried, half-dragged the dazed foreman with them, as the main tunnel behind them imploded with a deafening roar. They were in a smaller, narrower passage, the darkness absolute. They could hear panicked shouts and more gunfire from the chaos behind them. They stumbled forward, their only guide the feel of the rock wall. Suddenly Hugh stopped. He lit a match, the tiny flame pushing back the oppressive dark. In the flickering light, his face was grim. He knew Eva said, her breath catching. "My father. He knew you would be here." "No," Hugh said, his voice quiet but intense. "He did not know about me, but I knew about him. And I knew about Blackwood." He met her eyes, and in their depths she saw a pain that mirrored her own. "My people were not driven from the high country by the army, Eva. They were driven out when Richard Turner bought the land patents and diverted the water that fed our winter grounds. He drove us out to make way for his cattle." The final betrayal hit her with the force of a physical blow. Hugh, the man who had saved her, the man she had come to trust, to care for. He had known the truth of her father's sins all along. "Why," she whispered, "why did you help me?" The match trembled in his hand. "Because I looked at you, and I did not see your father's daughter," he said, his voice raw. "I saw a woman who fell from a horse. I saw a woman who learned to laugh in a dark room. I judged you for who you are not, for the name you carry." A figure appeared at the end of the tunnel, silhouetted by a faint light from above. It was Blackwood, his face a mask of fury, a pistol in his hand. He had found the way to the air shaft. Before he could fire, a new sound echoed from behind them, the scrape of boots and a pained grunt. Richard Turner staggered into the flickering matchlight, clutching a wound in his side, the shotgun lost in the collapse. Blackwood turned his pistol toward his old enemy. At last he breathed. No, Eva screamed, throwing herself in front of her father. Time seemed to slow. Hugh moved not toward Blackwood, but toward a series of rotting support beams near the tunnel wall. With a desperate cry, he kicked out the main support. The effect was instantaneous. With a groaning shriek of stressed wood and stone, the ceiling began to give way. Rocks and dirt rained down, separating them from Blackwood. He fired once wildly, the bullet ricocheting off the stone near Eva's head. Then, with a final guttural roar of rock and earth, the passage behind him collapsed completely, sealing him in the dying mountain. Silence descended, broken only by the trickle of loose dirt and their own ragged breathing. They were alive. Trapped, but alive. In the suffocating dark, surrounded by the ghosts of two families, Eva had to choose what came next. Justice or vengeance. Truth or lies. The sandstorm that had raged outside was nothing compared to the storm that had just broken within the mountain and within her own heart. The aftermath in the half-collapsed tunnel was a tableau of dust, darkness, and shallow breaths. Hugh struck another match, its fragile light a small defiance against the crushing weight of the earth around them. Jacob the foreman was dazed, but unhurt. Richard Turner slumped against the wall, his face pale, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. Ava immediately went to him, tearing a strip from her petticoat to press against the wound. It was a shallow graze, but he was losing blood. "Father," she whispered, her hands shaking. He looked not at his wound, but at Hugh. His eyes, usually so full of command, were filled with a weary, broken understanding. "You knew," he said. It was not an accusation. "I knew." Hugh confirmed, his voice flat. The silence between the three of them was heavy with the weight of generations. The sins of the father, the vengeance of the son, the quiet pain of the displaced. The mine was a tomb for one man, but it was a crucible for the rest of them. "The air shaft is just ahead." Hugh set his tone, pulling them back to the immediate need for survival. "The storm outside will have passed. We can climb out." The climb was treacherous. Hugh went first, finding handholds in the rock, then helping to pull Jacob, then Ava, and finally a weakened Richard Turner, up into the clean, rain-washed air of the desert night. The sandstorm had scoured the sky, leaving it a brilliant tapestry of stars. The world smelled of wet creosote and fresh earth. It smelled of life. They made their way back to the horses. The ride home was silent, a funereal procession, under the indifferent gaze of the constellations. Eva rode close to her father, steadying him in the saddle. Her earlier anger replaced by a profound, aching sorrow. Hugh rode slightly apart, a solitary figure cloaked in a history he had chosen to keep silent. Back at the ranch, while the doctor tended to her father's wound, Ava found Hugh by the corral, staring out at the dark expanse of the valley. "You should have told me," she said, her voice quiet. He did not turn. "It was not my story to tell. It was yours to discover." "Were you ever going to tell me?" He finally looked at her, and in the dim light from the house, she could see the conflict in his eyes. "I don't know," he admitted, the honesty of it a fresh wound. "When I was with you in the cabin, the past became quiet. I thought maybe it could stay that way." "It never does," she said softly. "No," he agreed, "it never does." She stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "You judged me for who I am. Now I am judging you. I see a man who chose mercy over vengeance. A man who saved the son of his enemy because he saw the goodness in his daughter." She reached out, her fingers gently touching his arm. "Our pasts are a part of us, Hugh. They don't have to be a prison." Their bond, tested by the crushing weight of truth, did not break. It settled, transformed into something deeper, more honest. It was no longer a simple story of rescue, but a complex tapestry of shared pain and deliberate forgiveness. The next morning, Ava sat by her father's bedside. He was pale, diminished, the arrogance stripped away, leaving only a tired, regretful man. "Blackwood," he began, his voice a dry rasp. "He's gone," Ava said. "The authorities will find the tunnel collapsed. They'll assume he died in the cave-in. It was a lie, but it was a necessary one. The cycle of violence had to end." "It should have been me," Richard whispered, looking at his bandaged side. "All those years, I told myself I was a builder, a pioneer. But I was just a thief with a better suit of clothes." He looked at his daughter, his eyes filled with a lifetime of unspoken shame. "Your mother, she tried to tell me. I wouldn't listen." "You can listen now," Eva said, her voice firm but not unkind. "You can't change what you did, but you can change what you do next. You can make it right." A glimmer of the old Richard Turner sparked in his eyes, not the tyrant, but the man of action. He saw the path she was laying before him, a path to atonement. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Tell me what I must do." Months passed. Autumn painted the cottonwoods along the river in strokes of brilliant gold. The seasons turned, and with them, the fortunes of the valley. Richard Turner, recovering his physical strength, but forever changed in spirit, did not hide from his past. He embraced it. He rode into Tucson not as a cattle baron, but as a penitent. he met with the territorial governor and federal land agents. He publicly acknowledged the fraudulent nature of the original Blackwood deed and the subsequent diversion of water that had displaced the local Apache bands. The confession sent shockwaves through the territory. Some called him a madman, others a saint. But no one could deny the courage it took. The resolution was not simple, but it was just. Acting on Eva's guidance, Richard Turner ceded a significant portion of his land, the original Blackwood claim and the ancestral Apache grounds near the high country, to a public trust. The water rights were restored, and the trust was to be administered jointly by a federal agent, a representative from the Turner Ranch, and a council of the remaining Apache families, with Hugh serving as its reluctant but respected head. It was an unprecedented act of reconciliation. On the day the documents were to be delivered, Ava stood with Hugh on a ridge overlooking the valley. The new boundaries were being drawn not by fences, but by a shared understanding. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, looking at the leather portfolio in her hands. "A new map is being made," he said, his gaze sweeping over the land. "It is a good day." They delivered the documents together, a quiet statement of a new partnership, a new future. Later that week, Ava rode out alone to the small cemetery on a hill behind the ranch house. The afternoon sun was warm on her back. She stopped before a simple marble headstone engraved with the name Eleanor Turner *. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver locket. Trackers had found it in the dust outside the Starlight mine, discarded by Blackwood in the chaos. She opened it, looking at the tiny, smiling portrait of her mother. For years she had clung to this image, a sanitized, perfect memory of a woman she barely knew. Now she saw the sadness in the painted eyes, the weight of the secrets she had carried. With a gentle reverence, Ava hung the locket over the corner of the headstone. She was not abandoning her mother's memory, but releasing it from the prison of a gilded lie. The locket belonged to the past, to a story of sorrow and secrets. Her future would be built on truth. She turned and saw Hugh waiting for her at the bottom of the hill, his horse standing patiently beside hers. He didn't speak, merely watched her, his presence a quiet promise. She walked toward him, leaving the locket to glint in the setting sun, a final silent atonement. Her steps were sure, her gaze clear. She was no longer defined by her father's name or her mother's ghost. She was Ava, a woman who had fallen and been remade stronger in the broken places. She reached Hugh, and together they mounted their horses and rode away from the hill, not into the sunset of a finished story, but toward the dawn of a life they would choose to build together.